Hey guys, this is miicrow here. I am finally putting together the long requested Flail VG guide. This is the build that I have been maining on a lot of servers at the moment and seems to do best in kind of larger scale combat. So think open world, OPR, kind of war situations, and is just very, very good at keeping your teammates alive while still providing enough debuffs to actually land some kills on the enemy. So this is like kind of a masterclass support build. It's very difficult compared to some other support builds in the past in terms of how many mechanics you need to keep track of. But if you're able to kind of keep track of everything and really balance the kit, it's not too difficult to play. It's just a lot of mechanics that you need to be aware of. And once you get those mechanics down, you're going to be able to carry your team to victory just by preventing your teammates from dying, as well as kind of catching the other team and making some plays yourself. So starting off here, let's go through the trees. Hey y'all, if you haven't subbed, please take the time to do so. We're still sitting at under a fourth of people that watch these videos actively being subscribed, and I would greatly appreciate the help. In terms of the flail, I find this to be best built to go for Arcane Smite, Arcane Vortex, and 1 point into Bludgeon. There is some debate on the last perk. You have options to go into Trip or Barrage for other builds, but for this particular build, it gets focused around clump fighting. So I think it makes more sense to go for Bludge because Bludge provides the best utility for clumps. In terms of like every single flail build, you should take basically every perk in Arcane Smite. Vortex is somewhat debated, but is considered to be very, very good, especially if you go for any focus-based setup. And we're going for a focus-based setup at this build, so we're going to go all the way down to get that flowing stability, which is known as being one of the best flow perks in the game if you actually play for it. And then we're going to take a lot of passives on this left side. We're basically taking every single passive that can consistently proc in PvP and provide value. We're doing the VG offhand, so I don't think this Vital Embrace gets as much value as some people think in kind of a larger scale, but is something that could be debatably run for something else like Flail Mary or for Spiky Impairment. We're not taking oppressive advantage here because the actual health bonus that you're going to be gaining in that haste bonus is super, super conditional. In order for this bonus to actually proc, you need to be hitting a target with an ability that's under half HP, and even then it's only going to be an effect that lasts for 3 seconds, so it seems really conditional. It sounds like it's going to get stripped a lot due to kind of clump meta being very VG heavy right now, with lots of debuff stripping, or sorry, buff stripping based effects. So I don't find this to be worth it, don't find it to be consistent, so I'd go for the other passives on this tree. We take better together, not because it actually heals for anything, like this actually basically heals for nothing, but because every time it heals an ally, you gain ult charge. This allows you to cast your ult more. Your ult, we'll go through this later, but your ult itself will be cleansing you of all your debuffs and just provides a lot of utility by just kind of going for that path. In terms of the right tree, we're basically taking everything here that is a utility perk because they're all good. The one that is noteworthy that you kind of need to know to play around is this mitigated protection. This appears to be an old fortify that is being applied to you when this procs, so it's really important to try to get those blocks in when a fight is actually happening, when a fight is breaking out. This buff is not strippable, not cleansable from a Void Gauntlet, Nullifying Oblivion, or from Diminishing Orb, which basically means it is a very, very good buff. It is up there with Sword and Shield's defensive formation for the best defensive buff in the game if you're able to proc it. So definitely recommend taking advantage of this and trying to block a little bit, even though we're going to be using a kite shield to get that ironclad superiority to proc where you're able to stagger with every single smite. So we are not built to block tons of hits, but we want to block some hits is the TLDR of this. Bludge is going to be used sort of as a counter to detonates, kind of as a mid-fight tool. If you use this too early, it's going to get stripped. If you use it after people are committed, this seems to be best. In general, your flail utility should be used after people have already committed to a clump fight. I tend to kind of mix up my lead-ins and how I get out of clumps, but leading with Smite generally feels pretty good, and then after that, going for a Vortex so people can kind of move away seems like it feels like a pretty good course of action, and if anyone is left over, then it can go for Bludge. Bludge can be cast a little bit more freely than the Smite and the Vortex. Both of these are kind of needed to counter clump fights. If you get that Smite off, it will apply deflecting frailty to your allies, which will apply a weaken to enemies and give your allies lifesteal. So it's a very, very good way to turn a fight by just throwing that down in a clump. Arcane Vortex will allow people to leave that clump because they're going to get cleansed. Will give them a haste, so they're going to be able to get out of dodge, and just overall will allow people to play the game for longer. Moving on to our VG now, we're doing a little bit of a different tree for this build because we're going into more focus and we don't have a lot of int. That means that we're not ever going to get below 50% mana unless you're like really trying to, but you have to put in a really big effort to get below 50% mana usage, so I don't find this to be super practical to go for. And instead, for cutting that perk, we're going to take Mending Evasion. Because we have focus, we're going to be able to heal when we dodge when we're at full focus, which seems to be relatively common, and this is healing me for about 1 to 1.5k with Ankh with 250 focus roughly, so it definitely seems like a notable passive to go for. Everything else here is pretty standard from a VG perspective. Typically, VGs go for this Forsaken Pack, they take this Radiant Efficiency, and they don't go anything else on this right tree. I think as of recent for this patch, a lot of people have been cutting Forsaken Pack to go for Radiant Efficiency, and sometimes even Fervent Thirst, just to allow themselves to gain more mana. But because we're not running Mag Gloves inherently with this build, we don't need to go for that mana usage. If we were running Mag Gloves with this build or trying a different variant, I would definitely recommend going for more mana kind of regaining effects, because you will be burning through your mana quickly if you run Mag Gloves with the Void Gauntlet. So that being said, with going over those trees, let's hop into the gear. Gear itself is relatively, I would say, straightforward for this class. You want to maximize on your health, you want to maximize on your refreshing, you want to maximize on your invig, and then your last slots are a little bit more flexible. I have been running Enchanted Ward just to help because people tend to auto me a lot on the point, and I just don't want to be in a spot where I'm forced to plot off of autos. If you don't want to run Enchanted Ward, some other good options are Elemental Aversion, and then also Freedom, as in running more Freedom. I could technically get the max Freedom stacks here with the actual Freedom pants itself, or I can get very close, and that would be another way to build this. The reason why I like going for Freedom, even though you have a natural Freedom-like effect with the Arcane Vortex, is because it will allow you to get out of dodge in situations in which this Arcane Vortex is stripped. Arcane Vortex always procs on this last swing of the flail where you spin around, and that's when that flailing stability procs. That's the time where people know to strip that now, and because it's kind of known that that is the time to strip it, and for those IGVGs that are really paying attention, it is very important to get out of dodge like relatively quickly after that proc, so that's why I'm calling cleanse all the time and war comms when it's up, so people can leave immediately, because it's very easy to read that animation from an experienced player and to strip that buff. And this will allow me to still get out of those situations even without that effect being present. That being said, you don't have to go for Freedom. The other option you can go for Magnetic Gloves, which I'll put on the screen now, but it's a very good heavy void, or not void gauntlet, but it's a heavy gauntlet that will allow you to really use those void gauntlet orbs and screams to more effectiveness. You'll get more CDR and be able to spam abilities more, but by using that gauntlet, I think you lock yourself into more of a VG flail build where your flail's your offhand and your VG's your main hand, versus the way I've been playing this. I've been playing it with the flail as my main hand and my VG as my offhand, if that makes sense. The other option I think has a good merit is to run Ginge, even though it's a medium helm on your heavy headwear, which will allow you to get to 90% reduction on disease, exhaust, and rend effects, which is very good to do overall. If you go for that sort of setup, you will basically only have Scream last for about 0.8 seconds on you, which is just kind of insane. It's just like very good at countering a lot of effects that are common in the meta right now. That being said, I don't think it's completely necessary, even with 4 Invig and your actual passive from your Void Gauntlet tree, which I didn't highlight a ton here, but this Reductive Superiority Kite Shield passive will decrease those debilitating effects on you by 10%. So with those combined, you should be, I would say, tanky enough to survive most situations where disease is heavily present. Moving on to the weapons now, because we've kind of gone over the armor and what perks you're generally looking for. You're going to be looking for Burning Smite, Frost Attunement, or any kind of attunement, Exhaustive Exploitation on your flail. I consider this to be best for basically every build. There's one other way to build the flail where you're building it for heavy attacks, where this would not be considered best in slot for that particular build, but I find that particular build to be a little bit clumsy and a little bit more niche, but has potential to still be good. This allows you to just get more value off of just hitting people with your autos in general. A lot of people might be saying, hey, why don't we have a refreshing move on Flail? That's just Biss, right? And that's why we run the Tai Kai Shield, which can be obtained in Ebon Skill, which gives you that refreshing move, gives you a 30% in power if you block a hit. Again, those blocks are really important. You're going to be generating more damage off of doing those blocks. It's just, you'll be able to do stuff off of that. And then you can upgrade this and you can throw on a Flail perk like Mending Vortex. As of right now in the game, it is not obtainable to get like this Mending Vortex perk in the wild, quote unquote, from a Flail. It is not obtainable to get Burning Smite from a kind of on the ground drop. All these have to be rolled because they're just bugged and were not added into the loot buckets by AGS for reasons that are unknown. Most likely just a lack of attention to detail, and that will allow you to kind of maximize on those Flail perks without having to sacrifice a lot of gear slots for them. You could also run refreshing instead of counterattack if you really wanted to, and then use that to run another defensive perk. But I find that counterattack to be proccing pretty consistently and to feels decently strong because it counters a lot of weakens because it's adding that empower thing, empower bucket that will counter weakens directly. This is also why we go for a Jasper, which will do 20% more damage after 2 seconds after you take a hit. This tends to proc very well. The other noteworthy thing about Jasper is the Rune Glass variant of it doesn't actually have a reduced effect. All the other ones, if you look at your T5 level versus the Rune Glass level, will have a reduced effect. So for Opal, it will go from 15 to 12%, which you can see here. And that just reduces the effectiveness of it. So that's like another bonus that you kind of get from this. On our Flail on our Void Gauntlet, we got Keen Speed, Keen, Scream. This is just to allow you to hit those crits a little bit more. Those crits will allow you to run around the battlefield, get you in position to use your Flail, and then Scream is just a good follow-up. Typically for most VG builds right now, Orb is better than Scream, but this build in particular, I am running Scream because I'm using Void Gauntlet as an offhand. It's more of a finisher. I'm not going to be spamming those orbs unlike some other builds, so I find the Scream to be a little bit more consistent of a utility for this class. In terms of your ultimate, Vines makes a lot of sense what we're running with on our jewelry because we're running a ring with Purifying Heart, Refreshing, and Hardy. This Hardy is mandatory for every single class. Refreshing is nice because there's not too many better perks, and I'd rather take some armor perks personally than some jewelry perks in the current state of the game. And Purifying Heart will cleanse the exhaust that applies from Brutal Heartrune of Grasping Vines, which is normally a kind of a limiting factor for it and made it risky to run. Now it basically has no downside and is just very, very good. We're running Ankh because it's Ankh and you need to be running Ankh. If you're not running Ankh right now and you are any build that is playing kind of in a clump situation, you're basically throwing. I don't think I need to go into more of that in this video. If you are a little confused about that, look at some other videos I have put out recently and I'll go into more detail with that. For the earring itself, we have basically champions, just non-upgraded version, I suppose. I could upgrade my old champions, but I believe I salvaged it at some point because I didn't realize you could upgrade it. But it's like the same concept where you want refreshing toast, regenerating. Regenerating just feels like a big heal with Ankh itself. A refreshing toast will allow you to use those pots a little bit more. Could be helpful for cleanse pots. Also is very helpful for generation serums, which generate stamina, which is why they're like super, super good for most classes. And then refreshing just seems like it's a decent perk overall. There's another perk on here that is like kind of decent that I don't take called Healing Heart. So every time you pop your heart rune, you'll get healed for 10% of your max HP. This will scale with Ankh, it will scale with 50 focus, it will scale with Divine, which is present on Ankh itself. So it will heal you for more than that. So this is like looking at like a 3 to 4k heal. So it's not that bad of a heal, and that's something else that you could run too if you want more burst heals. I just like the regenerating for more open world stuff, and just because it constantly ticks and I don't really have to think about it as much. We've gone over gear perks, we've gone over the actual consumes now. Now let's talk about like kind of the playstyle of this class. So this is a class that kind of plays as a secondary engage. So if there's a clump fight happening, you want to be waiting a second for your team to commit, for the other team to commit, and then you want to go into that clump with your cooldowns. Typically the best way to start a commit is with a smite, and then after that smite goes off, you can go for a block to try to get that blocking or sorry, to try to get that mitigated protection to proc. Once that mitigation protection procs, I like to go for my vortex, so I know that I'm not going to get nuked while I use my vortex, which is also going to heal for me for full. And then I'm going to basically throw in a bludge, and then I'm going to leave. There's a couple different variants of this, but this is like the general one that feels to be the most consistent. You could also kind of do a similar fashion where you lead with vortex, where you give people the cleansing effect, then you smite on the enemy's giant clump and have your allies walk into it if you want to be more offensive, and then follow this into either a scream or into a vines, and then after that you can go with a bludge to escape. So it basically just comes down to landing those CC effects and chaining them together. It seems very powerful to go with the Flail and the VG because they naturally have a lot of synergy together. That being said, there are some other acceptable offhands for a build like this. If you're thinking you're more of a shot caller, you might want to go for an Ice Gauntlet instead. Ice Gauntlet provides a lot more survivability. It's just the con of Ice Gauntlet is you typically have less utility. A lot of the Ice Gauntlet perks aren't as good as they used to be. Like, you don't have Ruinous anymore, so you're kind of going to lack in the gate phase no matter what. Uh, we haven't talked about our stat splits either, so I'll get to that in a second, but Ice Gauntlet's very good. Life Taker is debated for the VG slot. I would argue it's just not as good because it generates less ult charge, less ults, and the Bren utility that you get from Life Taker I don't think makes up for the fact that it just generates ult so much slower. You might think that, hey, this negative energy looks like it's going to be triggering a dot effect, which tends to give ult like very, very often. The problem is it has a 1 second cooldown, so it doesn't really apply off your AoEs like a normal Runeglass dot gem will, and you can't put a Runeglass dot gem in your Life Taker itself. The other option that's kind of interesting that I think it seems like it has potential is going for a pestilence-based setup, but this setup tends to rely as the Flail as an extreme main hand, not like kind of juggling between two weapons. And because of that, I think it's kind of essential to run Refreshing Ward with it, which is illegal right now. There is one piece of gear in the game with the PvP track that has this Refreshing Ward, but you can't change the Shirking Heals on here right now, and Shirking Heals is about to get nerfed. So I would be hesitant to go for this Pestilence setup, but that's something you could also go for if you want to try something, I guess, more exotic with this Flail VG build. In general, this build tends to thrive in OPR. It also tends to thrive in war, especially in those larger clump fights. So if you're in an OPR situation without any healers, this build is going to feel absolutely awful. So will every single bruiser build though. So will basically every clump build in the game just feels awful in a situation where you don't have heals in the OPR. Given that condition is present, this is like one of the better skill cap carry builds in the game, just because of the strict utility it applies. The important part about carrying with this build is providing stuff in the right order, in the right sequence of events given the situation. So for example, if I see another Flail as going for this flailing stability buff, I might try to drop an Oblivion on that right after it happens, and then I'll trigger that into Vines to lock them in place. I'll follow that up with the Stagger from Smite so that they can't use a Cleanse Pot because they're going to be caught in that animation of using a pot itself. Then I'm going to Scream them, which will also stagger them again. At that point, my team's probably likely collapsed on that clump. They're not going to be able to get their pot off before a clump fight happens, and they're likely going to die. So there's stuff like that that takes a lot of situational awareness, but it's a play that you're able to make with this build that you're not able to make with a lot of other builds in the game. With that being said, let me know if you guys have any specific questions about this build in general. The only other thing I think I need to touch on here is the attribute split. I go for 25 strength, 240 focus given optimal gear, and 350 con. The reason why I go for 240 focus and I don't go for above that 250 cap is I don't believe that in basically flail healing for anyone. I believe that the heal is an ult charge. I don't believe that the heal is getting a decent utility. That being said, I actually am healing for a lot in flails and wars. Roughly about a fifth of my damage I'm doing as healing, but that's not actually from the flail itself mostly, that's from the void gauntlet, because sometimes there's a clump fight going on and I'll just toss an orb, I'll do something with my flail, swap back to my void gauntlet, and then I'll detonate the orb, and that tends to heal people for about 2,000, up to 4,000 if they have Ankin or in a Sacred, so it can be good for clump fights to actually go for that heal from the orb itself, play as a sort of soft AoE healer because you have that focus, but other than that, I don't find the focus to actually be super useful. It's just kind of more synergy with the flail. You already have enough uptime once you get to 200 focus for most of your flail buffs to last a good amount of time. The devs are looking to buff this left tree of the flail too, which is noteworthy. They've said that in a recent dev vlog, and they talk about increasing the healing of it. I don't know if that means the better together or if that means stuff that they nerfed, like Arcane Vortex. This used to be a 2 to 6 second root immunity that scaled up to 300 focus versus up to 500 focus. It used to last a lot longer before. And that's something that could be buffed in the future and make Flail even better. But for now, I would say this is a very solid class. It's not something that you'll see a lot of in wars. You'll see about, I think, 2 to 3 of these in an army if you're kind of pushing it, but typically it's more along the lines of 1 to 2, but that being said, it's still an essential build to run, and it is very fun to run with that, and I hope you guys enjoy it. If you're one of those Flail mains out there, this is definitely something that is newer to the game, that seems like it's starting to gain popularity, and hopefully will continue to be popular in wars and OPR. And with that being said, I will leave you guys and see you in the next video. Peace. If y'all would like to see more of these build guides, I have a site where I've been putting some build guides along with the help of Sherlock Gnome here. He has been known for putting together a lot of good PvE content. The site is very good for kind of getting into that PvE space, whether it is how to tank, what weapons that you should be playing as a tank, whatever class you're playing, those build guides will be here. There's also support for things like the Worm, the Sand Raid, in terms of common strategies to use, and how the actual composition, how you should actually optimize for the raid itself. Gnome is kind of known for speedrunning a lot of this content, so he's a very good source for that side. I've been using this platform to kind of build out some of those more PvP style builds, but have them in a spot that is a little bit more, I guess, valid than other sites. It seems like there's been a lot of kind of misconception in terms of what is good, and I try to kind of bring a balance here to what is actually viable itself. So you'll find on here like a quick guide of what perks you need to actually go for with these weapons to get more value, what you need to be running on your bar, what gear you need to be running, the tree, and like a little write up on how you should actually be playing this build. And with that being said, I'll see y'all later.